All right, guys, so Coach Phil here with Better Pitching, and got something a little bit different, a little unique for you guys today. Different than kind of the traditional interview we've been doing. We're going to do kind of an interview slash mini webinar with, we've got a special guest with us here today, Josh Heenan. And some of you guys may be familiar with Josh. For guys who are not, he's the head strength conditioning coach for More PT in Southport, Connecticut. And really, for guys who follow my site, you know he's really my go-to guy when it comes to strength and conditioning for pitchers in the Connecticut area here. So really excited to have Josh with us here today. Josh, thanks for joining us.
Hey, thanks for having me, Phil.
All right, and Josh, to lay the groundwork a little bit, one of the things I've been talking about recently on the website and doing some videos on is the idea of leading with the hips, loading your hips in your pitching delivery, and getting your hips into your pitching motion. I did some videos, Masahiro Tanaka, looking at him. And what I wanted to do today, because you made a great comment on that post about how not every pitcher is going to be able to move like that. And you really need to understand the hip mobility issues that are involved when you think about your pitching mechanics. So what I wanted to do today was kind of a little mini webinar where we really dive into the idea of getting your hips into your pitching delivery, but more specifically, the idea of hip mobility and the role that that plays in your pitching mechanics. So to kind of start off, I mean, rather than kind of spending a lot of time going over your background and everything, I'll make sure I've got links below here on the website so people can check out, read up on you if they're not familiar. You got a great website yourself there at joshheenan.com. People can go over and check that out. Check out the content you've been putting up there, all really good stuff. But to start out, was hoping you could maybe talk a little bit about, first off, why is assessment important? And then more specifically, what do you look for when you are assessing a pitcher for their hip mobility?
Yeah, well, so if I get a little too nerdy or geeky, like slow me down and say, hey, nobody's going to understand that. I'll try to keep it really basic. So every single person moves a little bit differently, whether it's from genetic history of family traits to what they do on a daily basis, sports they play, jobs, things like that, and then just patterns they fall into. So if you're weak in one area of your body and you're weak in, let's say, one portion of your hip, it might throw off your pelvis a little bit, which is going to have a different dictation of how you move. So we do an assessment on every single person that walks through our doors, and that's going to dictate where their strengths are, where their weaknesses are, and how we need to train them, and where we're going to be limited. So the way I break up, we talk a lot about, for pitchers, hip and shoulder disassociation, and for me, I don't even look at guys' motions at the beginning. I try to go in with a blind eye, and really when people send me pictures that have something going on, they say something that doesn't seem right, but I don't look at those mechanics yet, because those mechanics might feed me into a different outlook of where I'm really trying to gear their assessment. And being unbiased, we can look at a bunch of things, and we talk about that hip and shoulder disassociation. And if I'm going to use I'm going to pretend like this is a right hip right here, and this is the ball and socket. So the femur sits in that socket, and that's going to allow us to rotate that hip. And we look at four real different things that are going to tell us what happens. And the first thing that most people skip in this industry, which frustrates me, is that they skip the pelvis. Okay. So the pelvis, if the pelvis is out of alignment, and that's more of a chiropractic thing, but they say it's out of alignment, but really it can be rotated or turned slightly one way or another. If it's rotated one way, it's going to give you more hip internal rotation or less hip internal rotation, or it's going to throw off how your hip actually sits in that joint. Okay. Then we can look at the bone of the hip, and the FAI, or femoral acetabular impingement, is a real hot trend right now that's coming up. And basically we're finding out that almost every single athlete has some form of FAI. So it just means that the bone is growing too big into the socket to move with a lot of motion. That's a genetic thing. Most of that is going to be handed down from your parents. And then we look at joint mobility, which a lot of people, that's the hot trendy word to talk about. Joint mobility is the ligaments in the labrum, if you will, the covering inside the femoral head into that socket and how much it moves. One might be jammed up a little bit because of maybe an impingement. It might be jammed up because of what you're doing on a daily basis. It might be jammed up because you're moving with some faulty movements. And the last thing is muscular stuff. So that's really any muscles that connect to our leg bone are going to dictate how much we can move. One might be tight, one might be a little bit lengthened. So there's really 4 of those things. Like I said, you got your pelvis, you got the actual the bone, and then the joint mobility, and then the last one, the 4th one, is those muscles playing into it. So we have to really assess which one is going to be needed to work on.
So kind of a lot of things going into, when you think of hip mobility in general, there's a lot of different things going on with the muscles, the bones, and all the other things going on in there. And then you talked a little bit about internal rotation, and a lot of pitchers and coaches may be familiar with the idea of internal rotation, external rotation in their pitching arm, because that's something that gets talked a lot about. But how can guys kind of understand that idea when it comes to your hips or your lower half? In that video we talked about with Masahiro Tanaka, he's a real good example of a guy who stays loaded up with his hips, very closed off with his hips. So would that be internal rotation?
Yeah, if I was standing, actually, I'll just stand and make it easy.
Okay.
If I'm standing facing you, and you can look at my hip,
all right.
If I'm rotating my knee in towards my other knee,
right,
that's internal rotation. So when we look at that internal rotation, we're a pitcher that has the potential to develop a very good shoulder hip separation really starts with the foundation of having that good internal rotation.
Okay, gotcha. So we kind of talked a little bit about the role that hip mobility plays in the pitching delivery. What will you do for a guy who maybe comes to you, you haven't looked at his pitching motion yet, but you assess him and you see some limitations in his hip mobility per se? Are there exercises, specific things that you'll work with him on?
Yeah, and definitely it's like I said, it's very person specific. If someone comes to me, and it happens quite often where someone comes and they have a really bad femoral impingement, that's something we can't fix. It's structure, it's bone. We're not moving that. But I have a couple exercises I'll show you. Let me know if you can see my screen.
Yeah, well, I can see it here, so I've seen it pulled up on YouTube.
Yep. So this would be for a muscular tightness, and most of the time when we're tight in our muscularly around our hip, it's usually in our hip flexors, our quad, psoas. And one really simple thing that we do is we'll do like a rear foot elevated split squat hold, or a split squat hold, or something where we get that back leg extended behind our pelvis, and we're putting that stretch on the quad. That's going to give us a little bit more room to breathe as far as how the hip's going to move. And then the other thing is, if someone actually has like a joint capsule mobility issue where the joint is just really kind of stiff and balled up in there, we'll use something like a band distraction, where we pop the band up into the groin, and then we'll get into more of like either a pigeon's pose or just a rocking position. And Kelly Starrett is actually a physical therapist in San Francisco that kind of guided everybody into this band distraction stuff. We use different stuff in PT that we don't use the band, but we do the same exact thing. And it's a great little exercise. It actually kind of, if you want to think about it, it almost dislocates the hip out of the joint. It really doesn't dislocate it, but it starts to pull it a little bit and gives it some more room to breathe. Okay, gotcha.
All right, so a couple interesting exercises there. And one here's like a specific case that I would have a question about, because this is something I see a lot. I'm sure other pitching coaches out there, or other parents working with their young pitchers, is guys who may be a little more predisposed to being sort of open hips maybe, or kind of having more external rotation in their pitching delivery. And a lot of times this is guys who tend to swing the front foot open in their pitching delivery, and as a result, when they land, they're kind of landing with their toe. Let's say it's a right-handed pitcher. He'll land with his toe sort of pointed towards first base.
Yep.
So he's like landing totally open with that front foot. And as a coach, you want to kind of say, you need to land with that front foot more closed, or you're going to be a lot more stable if you can keep that front foot a little more closed, and you're kind of like pulling yourself off towards first base. But
right.
Could that be a hip mobility issue? How do you work on that if it is a hip mobility issue?
Yeah, and you know what's funny is as you start going into this, it just rings bells with all these other guys that I've worked with, and a lot of times we attack that hip mobility issue right away, but the issues come, and that's why the body's so complex, is that if our abs aren't firing at the right time, and in our core, for lack of a better word, everything that's in the middle of our body, whether it's from the knees to the shoulders, is going to affect how the hips move. If our core isn't stable enough to sustain good mobility, we're never going to get that true hip disassociation. So what we try to do is we try to look at them and say, all right, how much mobility do they need? How much can we get? And then let's keep it stable. So the kid that does, like, let's say the band exercises because they're really, really tight in their hip, if we just give him the band exercises, he's going to feel good, but we need to strengthen it then, or at least remind his brain and his body that, hey, we have this new range and we're strong enough there to use it. It's just like that first time a kid really tries to rear back and throw it and the ball goes all over the place.
Right.
You need to sustain him, and you need to say, all right, now you might be able to throw the ball 80 miles an hour now, but
right.
Let's see if we can get it in the same spot, because your body knows it can do that, but now we need to teach the brain that it can replicate it and put it in a certain spot. It's the same thing as positional. We call it positional strength with that motion. So that's really what we'd be looking at most of the time.
Okay. So it seems like there are a lot of different ways to attack it, but the biggest thing that I found, it kind of all ties together. So the hips are, I view it as a really important area in the pitching motion. It's kind of the connection between the lower half and the upper half. So getting your hips into your pitching motion is huge. But that's one of the things I find as a coach is, I may have an idea looking at a pitcher's motion. Maybe I can get him on video, look at his pitching delivery, analyze it, and say, here are some things that you could do to move more powerfully in your pitching motion. But if you don't have that that framework, that base, that foundation of strength and mobility, then you're not going to be able to move the way that you need to be that powerful. Then it kind of falls apart. Like if you force those movement patterns on a guy who doesn't have that foundation or the ability to move powerfully through those movements, then it's just going to be a total train wreck. So
absolutely. And actually, let me pull up a real quick slide for you. That's kind of always like the aha moment for a lot of people. I gave this webinar a couple weeks ago, and one thing that I kept going back to because people had questions for is let me see if this will pop up for you real quick. Can you see that presentation there?
Yeah, it came up.
Okay, perfect. So let's see if I can find it. So this is a single leg bridge. This single leg bridge, this guy on the left-hand side where it says bad or poor, he is not in a straight line. He's got his butt's kind of sagging towards the ground. And knowing this athlete and working with him, he had some hip mobility issues, but really they're evident in his single leg bridge. Now, if we just rotated this bridge and had him standing up nice and tall, and that would be our pitching position. That would be our split stance where we land in that pitcher's power position. That's the same exact position. This guy is doing a bridge. He just happens to be bridging, pushing the ground behind him and having the other foot standing, and this guy has the other foot in the air. Now, the guy to the right here can do a good bridge. His hips, shoulders, and knees are all in one straight line. This means he can actually transfer that force properly all the way through the ground, just like you would when you're throwing. Now, I had a kid walk through my door. He's going to be, they project him right now to be a third-round draft pick, and he's a senior in high school. He can't do a single leg bridge. He is a left-handed pitcher that throws 96 miles an hour and can't do a single leg bridge. So it boggles the mind.
Right.
But so he has poor transfer of the lower body. Now he's setting himself up for, and this is how important hip mobility is. He's setting himself up for a whole host of problems. And the biggest one is really an oblique strain, because if he can't if he can't properly put that force into the ground by one leg and decelerate from the front leg, his obliques or elbow or shoulder are going to be picking up the slack for all that rotation. If he can put 96 miles an hour of rotation on the ball,
right,
and put that much force into the ball, he's getting it mostly from his trunk and from his arm velocity, and something has to decelerate it.
right.
And likely it's going to be his obliques. So it's just interesting to see how those incidents play together.
Yeah, definitely. Any deficiency or weakness is always going to be exposed in one way or another. Usually, unfortunately, with something breaking down. So that's being able to identify that stuff. That's huge. So that's great.
Yeah.
But that is amazing that a guy would be able to throw that hard and still have that kind of,
boggles the mind.
Jeez. And I know, talking about hip issues, and you talked, I think, in the beginning about some of the physical restrictions or maybe genetic limitations that guys have from a skeletal issue. I know you've dealt with some issues yourself with your hips, and this is something I've known a couple of young pitchers in this area who've already had, like as freshmen in college, had to have double hip surgeries to work on their hips. So it's obviously something that's becoming a little bit more common. Could you maybe just talk about your own experience with, I forget exactly the terminology for it, but you can go ahead and take it from
there. I had a right femoral acetabular impingement surgery where they basically took that big bone that was sitting out and cranking on my hip and wearing it down. They shaved it down a little bit and made it fit just nice and snug. It's very interesting on how we've migrated over the years and how more people have it. I think a lot of it is people are believing that a lot of it comes from kids that sit more and don't move as much and things like that, and a lot of it comes from genetics. And the interesting thing is I've never had a hip issue and never really had any moving issues until I started Olympic lifting, which never bothered it. But the other side of it was my dad was a very high elite Olympic level goalie, butterfly goalie. His hip internal rotation to this day is 3 to 4 times mine, and it's very interesting on how I migrated to have less hip internal rotation, have that femur be impinged in there. So they shaved it down and they resurfaced it a little bit, and I didn't have too much damage in there. They just needed to clean it up a bit and tighten it up, and I've had great outcomes. But everybody's very different, and every surgeon's very different. It's kind of it's a newer procedure in the grand scheme of things. So it's not risky per se, but definitely having a really good surgeon is a big deal in that whole process.
Sure. I think you talked about everyone's different, and that's something that's obviously very true. And that's one of the things I think you and I have very similar philosophies about. That's why I've enjoyed working together with you. Is that when it comes to what either your approach to pitching mechanics and helping guy develop a good pitching delivery, or the strength and conditioning component of it, it's not a one-size-fits-all approach. You have to kind of individualize it for that athlete, and then that's why that assessment comes in so much. And I know you've got a program that you put together relatively recently. I think it's Building the Perfect Picture. Maybe you can talk a little bit about that and how that came about, particularly about that kind of individualizing it aspect.
Yeah, well, we get, I get a lot of people flying in from out of state and a lot of people local that want to train, and sometimes timing's an issue, sometimes distance is an issue for consistency, things like that. So I kept having all these replies, and I figured, this is something I can put together, make a more generalized program, but actually have some individuality to it. And a lot of I have yet to find another program out there that actually allows you to do your own assessment and then have a program that will dictate your training regimen through that assessment. So that's really where I came with it, and some of the things are very, very broad scope generalizations, but through that evaluation, at least we can clear some things, make sure that we're not going to damage you long term, and have that long term health, so we can have that long term growth and hopefully achieve that potential.
That's awesome, and I think it's all about maximizing your potential as an individual, as an athlete, and taking the whole picture is huge. So whether it's analyzing your pitching motion and really, like as you mentioned, being able to kind of self-assess. So like one of my goals is to help guys understand what goes on in the pitching delivery enough where they can look at a video of themselves and be able to see what they're doing to sort of self-correct and not always rely on an outside influence telling them here's what you need to do, but sort of become their own pitching coach. And with your program, like you're talking about, helping guys assess themselves a little bit, and then being able to tailor their routine based on that. That's the same approach I take. So I think that's outstanding.
Yeah, no, and I love it. And the thing that I think you and I both really hang our hats on is the assessment stuff, making sure we have a baseline, and then the progression. And one of the things that drives me nuts is when athletes come to me and they're like, I've been working with this pitching coach, we're doing all these things, whatever. And I'm like, great. I'm like, where'd you start? Where are you now? Like, where are you trying to go? What's the difference? And they're like, oh yeah, they're just having me drop my arm earlier. I'm like, oh, that's great. I'm like, let me see a video. Let me see something that, and now it's where you're resting all of your faith that this person's eyes are perfect and they're not missing anything, and even perfect eyes are going to miss something. And I really love that you have that track record, and you follow along and you say, hey, your arm slot's here, we need to get it here for all 3 pitches. Let's keep working on that, and then overlay it. And it's great. I really do appreciate that.
So Josh, this has been awesome today. I appreciate you taking some time out to share some information. I hope this has been educational for people. I know it's been it's a lot of information. I think hopefully it'll at least open their eyes up to the issue of hip mobility and how big of a factor it can play in your pitching delivery. And they have your website to go to as a resource as well. And then I'll make sure I link up to your program so they can go check that out too. So thanks again for taking the time here.
Thanks, Phil. Thanks for having me.
Yeah, man. And I look forward to getting together down the road too, because this is just one very specific aspect of the strength and conditioning component to training as a pitcher, and there are a whole lot of other areas that we can dive into down the road. So look forward to doing that.
Definitely.